energy more.
Hello, a warm welcome to you all watching us live on Shaka Extra Time. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I am terrific, and I keep liking your fashion statements.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment, my friend.
But you are still making reference to Indonesia?
This, you could call it Afro-Asian fusion.
Very interesting. Those were politically, of course, part of what was called the non-aligned movement, which was neither west nor east.
Well, now we are taking it to the east, okay?
You might want to make reference to Shaka, because Shaka is wearing some reflection of the Modibo himself.
Well, I can also add that this is now the Ndiho collection. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we are talking about a wider range of issues. But we'll start in Egypt, where the Africa Cup of Nations is underway. Those who managed to make it to the Super 16 have played. Most of the teams are out. And now we are looking at a few teams that have managed to garner enough goals or enough support to continue. Your thoughts, Shaka?
It certainly has been a very interesting, football game and competition. It doesn't look very good when you talk about the fellows. We're talking about Egypt. Egypt, of course, has won it a record 7 times, won it all. And by the way, it was not supposed to be hosting this AFCON tournament. It was supposed to be hosted by another giant African football team, and that was Cameroon. And Cameroon, of course, like Egypt, is also out. Cameroon was supposed to be the defending champion. They are nowhere to be seen. They are not defending the championship because they have been knocked out.
What happened? The last time we had this conversation, we were talking about how some teams, especially like Uganda, some teams like Ghana, who are like really surprising a lot of people. But now we are down to some teams that were not even anywhere in the picture.
Well, it is very interesting that once in a while you get teams like Madagascar, for example, surfacing. It has to be arguably the Cinderella team of the tournament, Madagascar. And there are so many people who are rooting for it, including, of course, President Roger Arena of Madagascar himself. He was actually present, physically present, when they beat the Democratic Republic of Congo in what you call sudden death.
And to his credit, he managed to take funds right from his home country to all the way to Egypt. He paid. He chartered a plane to take a lot of funds to support the national team.
Very good, very good. As a matter of fact, that is something that is missing when it comes to supporting certain teams from certain countries. For example, a region where you and I come from has never had any claim on the championship. It does not know how that golden trophy looks like.
Maybe they don't know how to play the game very well.
Uganda came very, very close. As a matter of fact, the last time I checked, I was an undergraduate student in upstate New York, and they reached the final vis-a-vis the Ghanaian Black Stars. And the Black Stars did it again. I think it was the second time, in fact, at that time that they had won it all. They beat Uganda 2-1, and we didn't have much to celebrate.
Shaka, what's this thing about these teams losing teams, firing their coaches? It's kind of ironic. You have teams that have managed to make it to this great championship, but at the end of the day, the coaches get punished because they didn't perform to a certain extent. But when you compare that to, for example, African leaders who overstay their mandate, they refuse to get away when, why shouldn't the same yardstick apply to them, Shaka?
Well, I think you have a point, especially if, in fact, that particular country has provided all the necessary means, the necessary tools, the necessary support in order for the managers, the coaches, and what have you, to do their job and deliver the goods. If also political leaders, whether they be presidents or prime ministers, whether they be governors and what have you, if they have had the opportunity, for example, like some of these have really had plenty of opportunities. Some of these have actually had the dubious privilege of actually being in the State House for more than 30 years. You're talking about a generation here. If you can't deliver really in 3 decades, when are you going to deliver? There should frankly be some kind of arrangement, some kind of way, some kind of people, some kind of, authority that would come and sit down with this president and with this prime minister or governor and what have you, and say, you know what, Your Excellency, or the Right Honorable Prime Minister, you've had the opportunity to do your thing and beyond. You have not been able to deliver. I think it is really time for you to step aside, or at least to pass on the baton, so that someone else can come and score, because you can't simply hold the ball. You have to be able to dribble the ball. You have to be able to supply the ball or give it somebody who is strategically placed or located so that they can score. If you can't score, even politically, I think it would only be fair that you go back home so that you can also begin a new term of retirement.
How about, in fairness to some of those leaders, they argue that they are perhaps the best scorers on the team, and there is no reason why they should play as a team, rather play as individuals.
But first of all, you could only make that argument, and that argument could only be valid if indeed you were scoring. But if you are not scoring, Paul, then how can you possibly even waste time, really, to make such an argument?
And besides, wait a minute, Shaka, wait a minute. There are those who argue that they're actually the visionaries of those countries. Their programs, what those countries run on are their own visions. These countries are run as personal properties based on that vision that they have for those, for that particular country.
Paul, it is fine for you to talk the talk, but surely you should follow that by walking the talk, so that your people can walk the walk. If your people cannot walk the walk, that means you have not, in fact, walked the talk. It can't just be about talking the talk. Let's face it. Where is the beef?
Well, okay, let's do a quick follow-up. Shaka, what's your take on Museveni's $1 million gift to Uganda Cranes after they performed poorly at the AFCON games in Egypt?
Well, I think that, he's trying to be nice by providing something that makes the players happy and all that kind of stuff. But I think what is needed really is not simply reacting. It is initiating. You have to initiate by providing the necessary tools, the necessary training facilities, the necessary coaches and the managers and what have you, and to make sure that their morale is very, very high, so that at the end of the day, they can play and win.
So are you suggesting that this came a little bit too late?
Yeah, I think it is good to thank the athletes for their contribution towards the national psyche and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? You really have to reward someone because they have accomplished something.
And in this particular case, nothing.
Well, you could say that they were able to move in the knockout rounds. They are able to move in the knockout rounds. There are a lot of other teams that couldn't quite make it that far.
Well, okay, let's move along. Let's move along. Let's go to Sudan. Things are still standing as is. Nothing much has happened, despite the fact that the opposition and the current military council, the transition, have agreed to share power.
I think that we really need to be patient. We need to allow for some time so that something really takes shape in Khartoum. First of all, I think we need to congratulate the people of Sudan. We need to congratulate the key players, both the military council and the leaders of the opposition, civil society, professional groups, and what have you, who actually reached a compromise. And this compromise, frankly, is very necessary because, let's face it, failure is not an option. Failure is not an option. They have already failed during the last 30 years. That Field Marshal Omar Bashir was at the political harem of the Sudan. Sudan, the last time I checked, used to be the largest country in terms of land size in as far as Africa is concerned. Omar Bashir presided over the splitting of Sudan. Now Sudan is made up of two countries, and two countries, frankly, which do not function well. So I think that Sudan can no
But in
longer...
fairness to Sudan itself, it has been, there's been a semblance of peace and stability in northern Sudan.
It depends what you mean by a semblance of peace and stability, because you cannot have peace and stability without having what they call social, economic, political justice for all the Sudanese.
Let's be a quick follow-up from Roman Athile. Will the Sudanese military agreement with the opposition work, or we are looking at something that is akin maybe to what happened in Kenya during that power-sharing agreement, something that happened in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe reached out to the main opposition leader, Morgan Tsvangirai?
I think that there is a precedence, at least in the context of Sudan. They had what you would call the agreement, basically, the comprehensive peace agreement. They had that, and it resulted, for example, into the splitting of the nation, as it were. And now you do have two Sudans. One is Sudan, whose capital is Khartoum. The other is the Republic of South Sudan, whose capital is Juba. And so I think there is a precedent. And frankly, as I said a little bit earlier, I do not think the players, nor or the people of Sudan, I do not think that they can actually have an option of failure. That is not a luxury they can afford. The fact that they became conscious of the fact that neither the military can do it alone, nor the civilian opposition politicians can do it alone, I think they saw something very interesting, because as somebody once suggested, Paul, as an individual, you can run very, very fast, pretty fast. But together, you can actually go and get very far. And I think we should really support the political compromise that obtained in Khartoum, where you have what they call the Sovereign Council, made up of 11 people. and 6 of these 11 people are non-military.
Let's do a quick follow-up here. There's somebody who wants you to talk about the East African Federation. Let's go to Hello Nzama. Is the East African Federation going to work? Maybe we can tie that to another question that has been coming. I think we tried to address it last time. Will Uganda get to political maturity like Kenya?
Well, first of all, when you talk about the East African Federation, the last time I checked, there has not been or never been any such thing. I don't know anything called the East African Federation. What I know is that there is the East African community,
yep,
but not the East African Federation, because that would be a political arrangement, which would therefore mean that the member states that form up the East African community would seize their individual sovereignty so that they could actually form a political entity that would be headed by one political leader who would either be appointed or even better, perhaps better still, would be elected by the people of the East African community. There was talk initially about fast-tracking the federation, East African Federation, but the last time I remember I had a live Straight Talk Africa interview or program from the Tanzanian political capital Dodoma with the then Tanzanian President Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete. We're talking about 2007 here. That's a very long time ago. It looks like there were a lot of problems. Tanzania, for example, was not ready for that. And some other countries also did not seem to be ready for that, except that the Ugandan President, Yoweri Museveni, happened to be splinting towards that, and he was the elder statesman in the region. It was assumed that he would have the opportunity and the honor to be the first East African head of state. It never happened, and probably won't happen on his watch.
Speaking of a federation, something remarkable just happened over the weekend. 55 African countries agreed to a continental free trade zone. I think by any measure or standard, that's a remarkable development, considering that most of these African countries are not at par. And secondly, it takes longer to travel across Africa. Your thoughts?
You're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Zone. Yes.
Terrific. And I think, frankly, we should basically give credit to the man who came up with that idea and pushed it, despite a lot of naysayers, and that is the Rwandan president, Major General Paul Kagame.
Did I hear that very correctly?
Yes.
You're giving
He
President
deserves
Paul
credit,
Kagame.
yes. He deserves credit. I give credit to whomever deserves it, including President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. There were a lot of people who did not think initially that that was something that was practicable, especially because initially 2 African giants, we're talking about Nigeria
And South Africa.
Nigeria and South Africa, they are 1 and 2 in terms of the largest markets and what have you. They were very reluctant to embrace the idea. But over the weekend, Nigeria finally accepted it to be part of the club, and I think it has a lot to benefit out of that kind of market, because let's face it, when you talk about the African continental free trade area, you are probably talking about the largest market of that kind since the World Trade Organization.
I mean, you're looking at about $3.4 trillion if it's implemented very well.
Yes, and you are looking at a market of at least about 1.2 billion consumers.
Let me go back a little bit to Rwandan President Paul Kagame. The point that you just made of him taking credit, doesn't this vindicate him? There are people out there who argue that he's arguably a visionary, one of those guys who sees very far. And by him coming up with this idea, sort of takes away all the other criticism that we are used to talking about or reading in the news.
It doesn't really take away the other criticisms, especially of denying his people the right to own an opinion that may be different, for example, from the Rwandese Patriotic Front, which is running the country, or that may be different from his. If you're talking about that, then we can put it in a broader historical context. We can look, for example, at a man called Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a man who came to power in what was called the Soviet Union in 1922. This is when he came to power. This is when the founding father of the Soviet Union, Lenin himself, was bedridden until he dies 2 years later, 1924. Stalin rules from 1922 to 1953. And arguably, you can say, without Stalin, you probably would not have had the Soviet Union then, as it were, as a superpower. He created a superpower. But guess what? In 1989, what happened? The Soviet Union collapsed. There is no such a thing as the Soviet Union anymore. At the end of the day, it is good to build markets. It is good to build roads. It is good to put in place physical infrastructure. But what you cannot dispute, what cannot be disputable, is the building of people's minds. What is very important is the freedom of human beings, the freedom to think. The freedom to think, because when you are a leader, it assumes that you are actually leading people. You are leading people. And if you are leading people, you cannot deny them the basic rights of thinking. Because a former US president, Barack Obama, actually said, even with prosperity, without freedoms, it is a form of fundamental poverty. I couldn't agree with him more.
I couldn't agree with him more either. Another follow-up, again on Rwanda. There are critics who say that, yes, this is great, President Paul Kagame coming up with this, but can he look himself in the mirror? For example, we are talking, it's been months, the Uganda-Rwanda border is closed. So how do you justify, isn't that being a hypocrite? You're talking about having a continental free trade zone, and yet your own border is closed. Your own country is now technically a landlocked country.
You know, Paul, someone once suggested that human beings are essentially products who happen to be composites of contradictions. And so are leaders. So in this particular case, you are actually describing or defining Rwandan President Paul Kagame as essentially a composite of contradictions. He's a human being.
Interesting.
He gets some things good, and he doesn't get some things so good.
So to human is error.
And to forgive is divine.
Okay, let's move along. Let's talk about ECOWAS. ECOWAS is also doing something interesting. The 15-member bloc over the weekend also finally agreed to come up with their own currency. I don't know what this means for France, because most of these West African, especially the Francophones, have been using a currency, the CFA, pegged to France. So what does this mean? Could France potentially go to war with some of these African countries?
I don't know how it is pegged to France, because the last time I checked, the French do not use the CFA.
But they are the guarantors.
The French use the euro.
Correct, but France is the guarantor of, or the guarantee of this currency.
It controls, basically.
Absolutely.
It controls and...
so what does that mean for the Africans, average Africans, the economies?
I think it is a very significant positive step in the right direction, if it can work. And I hope it works really, because I think Africa needs those types of, victories really. Again, I often say that Africa is not poor, or Africans are not poor because Africa is poor. On the contrary, Africa is incredibly endowed with wealth. Perhaps the richest actually continent in terms of resources and what have you on this planet Earth. But unfortunately, Africa is not endowed with visionary leadership. There is some kind of leadership deficit to harness the potential that is there for Africa, to harness the potential, to make sure that you mobilize and use the resources for the benefit of the daughters and the sons of Africa. We need that type of leaders. It is a high time we did. And in fact, we should borrow from ECOWAS. Because ECOWAS, mind you, is not only championing this idea of a common currency in the region, they have already done something very remarkable when it comes to respect for democracy. You remember what happened to the Gambia?
Correct.
It was ECOWAS, not the African Union, not the East African Community, not SADC, it was ECOWAS. So I think ECOWAS is onto something. And I hope and wish this something can actually be broadened to the extent that it becomes an African thing.
Let's do a quick follow-up from Robert Ochola. As long as Africa still recognizes colonial borders, there will be no unity. These trading blocks are just fallacies that are created in the morning, and by the evening, they are no more. African leaders are most visionless.
Yeah, but you know, at the end of the day, I don't think that we as Africans should abdicate that type of responsibility to these people that we call leaders. First of all, a lot of these people are not leaders really, because they are not chosen in a democratic way. A lot of these leaders, actually some would say the appropriate language definition would be rulers.
But in fairness, all these West African countries who came together in that bloc, they're all democratically elected. You could argue?
Well, you could say that, yes, for the most part, you could say that. But I think there is a very long way to go. First of all, I think Africa, it's a high time it has to embrace democracy. If democracy means a reflection of social, economic, political justice for every African.
Very quickly, what are you talking about tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we are going to be having a very interesting discussion, and we are going to be looking at...
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for being another terrific guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
And of course, it is the historical black colleges and universities and its impact on Africa.